This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here. This is a topic that is sometimes very confusing. I think interesting, and I hope you feel the same about halfway through this thing. Well, let's start. So, principles of radiation disasters. Just quickly, a financial disclosure slide. I do not have any stock in any radiation companies or anything like that. So, here's what I hope to get through during this presentation. So learning objectives for this presentation is to know the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, to understand the different types of radiation exposures and their consequences, to become familiar with the types of radiation threats that exist, to understand the long and short-term health consequences of a radiation exposure, and to become familiar with ways that you can protect yourself during the unlikely radiation event. Let's start off with the very basics. Okay, I'm not a physicist, I'm a physician, and so there's some things about radiation that I will unfortunately not be all the way up to date about, because as you know, physicists who specialize in this area of physics are people like Albert Einstein, right? And I'm definitely not up to par with Albert Einstein. But we will nonetheless try to get through at least some of the basics so we can understand what is radiation and what does it do. So the most basic definition of radiation is the subatomic particles, electromagnetic waves that can interact with matter. Matter being you, me, inanimate objects, anything. Okay, there's two different types of radiation that we talk about, and only one of them is really the type that we're focusing on tonight, and that's the ionizing radiation. This is the type of radiation that is powerful enough to affect your DNA and to cause problems with your DNA and break bonds. The low energy non-ionizing radiation is not powerful enough to affect DNA bonds, and you'll be familiar with some of those types of radiation as well. This slide illustrates the different types of radiation from the non-ionizing side to the ionizing side of the spectrum. For the non-ionizing side, you have things like radio waves and microwaves, infrared, even the visible light spectrum. These are all technically types of radiation, but these radiations are not powerful enough to affect your DNA bonds. It's not going to damage you per se unless it's focused like a microwave, very directly at your person. When you move towards the ionizing type of radiation, we look at things like ultraviolet light. So that's like sunlight. And we're all familiar with things like sunburns, right? That is a radiation injury. You have ionizing radiation and ultraviolet light that is causing injury. And then the type of radiation such as X-rays and gamma rays, these are extremely powerful types of radiations that have uses in medical science, uses in, unfortunately, warfare, and terrorism, and all kinds of different things, mostly good things, especially things like nuclear power, which can be beneficial, but can also something we need to respect and can cause some problems too, as we'll see moving on. So focusing a little bit more on ionizing radiation, these are divided into really 4 different types. Alpha radiation, this type of radiation is really not powerful enough to penetrate the skin. It can be stopped just by a sheet of paper and will kind of just bounce right off your skin. This radiation, if you're exposed to it from an external source, is not going to injure you. However, if you ingest this type of radiation, it can be very dangerous. And one of the more dangerous types of radiation, as we'll find, again, moving forward. Beta radiation, this can penetrate and can get just a little bit inside the skin and can cause some problems. Gamma and X-ray, as we're familiar with pictures doctors take of us, can definitely penetrate you completely and can get all the way through your body and can cause problems. It can also do things like treat cancer. It can also do things like provide medical professionals with imaging so that they can treat what problems you may have. And so this is a really important type of radiation. And finally, neutron radiation, also very strong penetration, and most of its uses are in nuclear power and nuclear weapons. In terms of how do we talk about radiation, for our purposes, what we're most interested when we talk about the type of radiation or the dose of radiation that we are exposed to is RADS or REM. That's kind of our the traditional terminology. Gray and Sievert is their international unit. We're going to probably focus more on RADS and REM because a lot of the literature uses RADS and REM when they're kind of going through the basics of radiation. And to put that kind of in perspective, all of us, just by living our lives, walking on this earth, being exposed to sunlight, being exposed to radiation from rocks in the ground, we're going to get about 300 millirem of radiation per year. It's unavoidable. It's just part of our life, okay? A chest x-ray is going to expose you to about 10 millirem of radiation at one moment in time. If I were to get a CAT scan of your head, you'd get about 200 millirems of radiation at one moment in time, almost a year's worth of radiation in just that study. When I order an abdominal CAT scan, I'm exposing you to a very large amount of radiation, 3 years worth of the radiation you would have otherwise received just walking around the earth, okay? And if you are someone who wanted to fly from New York to London, you would get 4 millirems of radiation just being that much closer to the sun, okay? So that's kind of put things in perspective when we start talking about REMs and RADs, okay? So millirem is 1/1000th of a rem, and a rem is roughly equal to a rad, okay? So a rem and a rad are roughly equal when we move forward here. The lethal radiation dose, which is really germane to our discussion today. In toxicology, or anytime we talk about poisoning or dosing of even a medication, we'll often talk about an LD50. And what that means is that's the dose of radiation or dose of any substance that it would take to kill half of the individuals who would receive it. So if there were 2 of us standing here and we each got a dose of the LD50 dose of radiation, on average, one of us would be able to survive it and one of us would not be able to survive it. Okay, for radiation, we're talking about 450,000 millirems, and that's as a single dose at one time. All right, and remember, if we go back to this slide here, we're talking about me ordering 450 abdominal CT scans on you at a single moment in time. Okay, so it's a massive dose of radiation for the LD50 dose. People who are exposed to 1 million millirems, or about 1,000 rads, that dose is considered universally fatal. Okay. So types of exposure, internal radiation exposure. This is more of a rare occurrence. There's not a whole lot of cases in the literature about internal exposure, but this is when you inhale or ingest a radioactive substance and it starts to become radioactive within your body. Your cells and your tissues take it up, and then you yourself become a radioactive substance, okay? Examples of this could be ingesting contaminated water, food, or breathing in particles if there were a radiation event that radioactive materials were released into the air. Okay, this grave right here is one of the more recent examples of a person who suffered and unfortunately succumbed to the effects of an internal radiation exposure. His name was Alexander Litvinenko. Okay, the circumstances around his death are still quite shady, but he was Yes, this gentleman was poisoned with polonium-210. This was an alpha-emitting radiation substance. It was estimated it was probably about the size of a grain of sand that they were able to somehow get into his food. And over the next 6 months or so, he became very sick and unfortunately succumbed to his injuries. He became so personally radioactive that things like his car or his home, areas where he would sweat or just oils of his body would touch things, they became radioactive and became unlivable for about a period of 6 months or so. You could not even enter those facilities. So it was a good example of the dangers of internal radiation exposure, and a very sad example too, and still quite a controversial one in terms of who did it, right? Contamination. So this type of exposure would be if you got a radioactive substance on your person. Okay, so you know, for whatever reason, we're playing with a radioactive device and got some of the radioactive substance on your body. That's considered you're contaminated with radiation. Okay, when you're contaminated with a substance like radiation, a radioactive substance, you require decontamination before you're able to be, effectively treated by medical personnel and first responders. And so you would have people approaching you in this type of getup if you were radioactive or had radioactive contamination. This is in direct contrast to irradiation. I think this is a kind of a key point between contamination and irradiation. All right, when you are irradiated, that means you are exposed to a radioactive substance. It's not on your person, but the radiation from that substance has passed through your body as a field. Okay, this is a more common type of radiation injury, and we see it in medicine from things like radiation therapy from cancer, abdominal scans, or let's say you have to go to the cardiologist to get a stent in your heart, and they're giving you radiation so they can see where they're moving their line. To put that stent in your heart. This is irradiation. So you're not getting substances on your body, but the radioactive substance is emitting radiation onto you, okay? So it's an important distinction, because just because you've had a radiation field pass through you does not mean you need to be decontaminated, okay? Because you don't actually have substance on you. You've just been exposed to radiation. Does that make sense? Because it's kind of a difficult concept a little bit. So what are the effects of radiation? So we'll start with kind of the acute effects of radiation. What can you expect when you are exposed to a radioactive field? These are called non-stochastic effects. And I don't know, honestly, where the term came from, but when you talk about radiation, you talk about the non-stochastic effects and the stochastic effects. The non-stochastics are what happens to you acutely, and the stochastic effects are things that are sequelae from later on exposure to radiation, okay? So cutaneous radiation injury. This is one of the first effects, and maybe one of the more common things that we would see in the medical field from radiation exposures. Okay, oftentimes the reason that we would see an effect like this would be from a person who's undergoing radiation therapy for cancer. So they're intentionally having radiation beams, shot into their body to kill a cancer. This gentleman. This was on the FDA's website, and he was undergoing a heart catheterization procedure, getting a stent put in his heart. And the thing that's different about radiation burns versus just burns from a fire or something hot is that these burns show up gradually and get worse over time. Okay, so you probably can't see that well in this picture. This is 8 to 12 weeks after his exposure to the fluoroscopy in a cardiac catheterization procedure. He's got this little ulcer right there, okay? Within 18 to 20 months, he's got this giant necrotic ulcer that's shown up, and it became so difficult to treat that they ended up having to surgically remove that dead skin and graft skin onto that area. So it's very painful. It's oftentimes more difficult to treat than just a thermal burn or just a burn from heat because oftentimes its effects are delayed over time and you're not sure exactly how bad it's going to get. Okay. So whole body irradiation or acute radiation syndrome. So this syndrome is specifically a type of syndrome that occurs when you are exposed, your entire body is exposed to a large dose of radiation, okay? There's 4 phases to the acute radiation sickness or acute radiation syndrome. When you're initially exposed to a large amount of radiation, you have what's called the prodromal stage. Okay, so it's a very transient stage. Depending on the dose of radiation that you receive, the onset could be within minutes or it could be within days. The prodromal phase initially is usually associated with nausea and vomiting and feeling terrible. And then it generally starts to give way, and most people then have a latent phase. Your symptoms improve. You start feeling better, and this can last from hours to weeks until you get to the manifest illness phase. And this is a dose-dependent phase, okay? And this can last for hours. It can last to months. And then finally, once you've had the manifest illness stage, it progresses to death or recovery, depending on the dose of radiation that you received and how you tolerated that dose. The general rule is the larger the dose of radiation, the shorter you progress through these stages, okay? So if you receive a massive 1,000 rad dose of radiation, your prodromal to death recovery phase could be as short as 48 hours. If you receive a small dose of radiation, something like 70 rads or something along that line, you may progress through this over the course of months or have some of these effects for years. And so it really depends on the dose as to how quickly you progress. So there's a few syndromes within acute radiation syndrome, and these are the dose-dependent syndromes. So the lowest dose that you can receive that would lead to acute radiation syndrome affects your hematopoietic system, okay? So it's a hematopoietic syndrome. And what this is you receive a dose of radiation, something like 70 rads of radiation, and you have a prodrome. It can last anywhere, or it can occur anywhere from 1 hour to a few days after the exposure, and you start with nausea and vomiting, okay? This gives way, and you have a latent phase for a few weeks, and you move on to the manifest illness stage. And the manifest illness stage for hematopoietic syndrome is mostly fever and malaise. You probably continue to have some nausea symptoms as well. But what's happening is the radiation dose that you've received has killed the stem cells within your bone marrow, okay, or significantly declined the number of stem cells in your bone marrow. And so what the problem is you have now lost the ability to create cells that can fight infection. You've also lost the ability to create blood products like platelets that can keep you from bleeding, okay? So that's a big problem when you are dealing with the hematopoietic syndrome, is that you have a problem fighting infection, you have a problem being able to control bleeding, okay? The death recovery phase can take anywhere from weeks to years. Most people can recover, and some people we do start to see deaths around 120 rads of radiation. Okay, I'm sorry, this girl was a victim in Hiroshima. So acute radiation syndrome part 2, this is when you receive a dose anywhere from 600 to 1,000 rads of radiation. And I give some of these spreads because different sources give different doses of when they feel that this kind of comes on. The prodrome of this syndrome is you typically will have an onset if you receive a dose large enough to cause this syndrome. You'll have an onset within hours or so of severe vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, with a latent phase about 1 week. This experiment here is actually, this photo is a recreation of an experiment that took place at Los Alamos, where a physicist named Louis Slotin was exposed to a large dose of radiation and gave him something close to a gastrointestinal syndrome when you read about his effects afterwards and how he finally succumbed to his radiation dose. He said what happened was there's a plutonium core in here, and again, I'm not a physicist, so I probably won't explain this well, but he combined 2 pieces of metal that led to a critical mass. And the people who witnessed this said the entire room started to glow blue, okay? And he dropped this core immediately and the radiation stopped. However, he immediately, within a few hours, started to develop severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and eventually died from intestinal kind of necrosis, okay? So his gut finally gave out, okay? And ended up succumbing to his injuries. So like I was just explaining with that last case, the manifest illness stage of the gastrointestinal syndrome, you have severe diarrhea, fever, malaise, and this is because your bone marrow, you still get the effects of the hematopoietic syndrome and the gastrointestinal syndrome both together now. So your bone marrow and your GI lining, your gastrointestinal lining of your stomach and your intestines have now both started to die. And so you'll have problems with infection still because your bone marrow has been affected. And you'll also have dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. And this syndrome, because of the dose of radiation to cause it is so high, is typically fatal to everybody who receives it within 2 weeks. So acute radiation syndrome finally has a third subset called the cardiovascular neurologic syndrome. This is a universally fatal dose of radiation, somewhere in the order of 2,000 to 5,000 rads of radiation at once. This gentleman, also unfortunately a Los Alamos victim, he operated one of these mixing, for lack of a better term, pots, I guess, and there was plutonium within these. And he turned on the mixer, and the plutonium combined and let forth a big burst of radiation, upwards of 2,000 rads of radiation. And he immediately fell to the floor and started saying, "I'm burning up," and started to have bad vertigo symptoms and became confused. And unfortunately, within 35 hours of being exposed to that massive dose of radiation, he passed away. Very, very sad case. The civil case surrounding this actually was going up until somewhere in the 2000s. They were still fighting a civil case about this incident. So again, the manifest illness stage can occur as quickly as 5 hours from the exposure. And again, you get all the effects that you would have from the hematopoietic syndrome and the GI syndrome, but you also have a central nervous system effects as well at this point. And all of these things happen a lot more intensely and a lot sooner. Okay, so you die pretty quickly from hypotension or shock, which is your heart is affected. You go into comas, you have seizures, and again, infection and dehydration can also be a problem. And it's universally fatal within 3 days. Okay. And so how can we tell? Let's say we don't really know what dose of radiation you did receive, and you come in saying you were exposed to a radiation source. Okay. The way that we can prognosticate or find out how you're going to do despite being exposed to this radiation is looking at what's called the Andrews lymphocyte nomogram. Okay, this is a kind of a plot that can help us figure out, based on your lymphocyte count, how severe the dose of radiation was. And so 2 days out, if I measure a lymphocyte count that's less than 100, I know that that's pretty universally lethal, okay? If I measure a lymphocyte count 2 days out and it's somewhere around 1,500, up in this range here, you probably are going to survive that, but I'm going to have to be giving you a lot of support, okay? Well, what can we do if you're exposed to a radiation event like this? Back when Cecil Kelly and Louis Sloat and some of those other cases were exposed to injuries like this, there wasn't a lot. We didn't really even know what was causing the syndromes that they were having. Now we have some ideas, but again, this is not radiation poisoning is not a sickness that we encounter often. There's been something like 400 cases in the last 40 years. Okay, so it's not something that we have a lot of experience treating. However, knowing how radiation affects us, we have ideas of what we can do to try to get you through some of these episodes. Most of the treatment that we're going to be providing in a radiation event is going to be supportive, giving you fluids, nausea medication, pain medication. We're, of course, going to be trying to prevent infections because now you're going to be more susceptible to infections. You need antibiotics, antivirals, antifungals. Okay, and the other things that we're going to be looking at is how can we get your body to start fighting infections and things now on its own. And that's going to be, there's certain medications that can try to stimulate the bone marrow to produce the white blood cells and other factors that you may need in order to survive these events. The other things that we can do, we give you transfusions of platelets. Sometimes we give you transfusions of stem cells. They've tried bone marrow transplants for some radiation victims and had some marginal success with that. And so some cases are universally fatal depending on the dose, but there are some things we can do, especially if you're in that hematopoietic syndrome type radiation dose. Okay. So again, not all of the effects are going to be physical. A lot of people who witness a radiation exposure, even if they're not directly affected by radiation exposure, have a lot of psychological effects regarding this. Okay, there's an incident that happened in Guyana, Brazil, where two gentlemen broke into an abandoned hospital and stole a radiation teletherapy capsule. So this thing has a core of cesium-137. That's the radioactive substance, and it's wrapped up in this core. And they found this thing and thought, hey, maybe I can sell it for scrap. Okay, so they brought it home, and they spent days trying to break into this capsule with, sledgehammers and screwdrivers. And they were finally successful, despite the fact that they were both experiencing, bad symptoms of nausea and vomiting. They kept going because they didn't connect the dots that this device could be what's causing their symptoms. And so they finally got this stuff out, and this is a blue glowing substance, as most radioactive substances are, blue and glowing, and they thought it was amazing. And so they brought it to the local scrap dealer, and the scrap dealer said, this is great, and the scrap dealer brought it home to his children. His children picked the stuff up and said, what is this glowing substance? It's so fun. They painted their faces with it. And people started to notice that everybody was getting sick from this. And so the wife of that scrap dealer finally said, something's going on, and they brought him to the hospital, and they finally figured out, this is probably radiation poisoning, and this is a capsule that's used to treat people with cancer. And so unfortunately, there were about 4 deaths from this exposure. I believe this scrap dealer did not die, but his wife and child did die, and there was a few others that died as well. Overall, there was only about 250 people who were actually exposed to this. However, the population, just knowing this story and knowing that they lived in this area, pretty much all showed up at the hospital and wanted to get screened for a radiation exposure. Okay, and when you're in a small community like Guyana, Brazil, you have 125,000 people who now are panicking, thinking that they've got a radiation exposure. It can, put the brakes on your normal operations pretty quick. And so it's a very real effect, the psychological response from radiation. It said up to 5,000 people who were not even exposed had symptoms because they just had that in their head that, radiation was nearby. So let's talk about some of the stochastic effects, okay, the long-term effects of radiation. Anybody know who this is? Yeah, Marie Curie. She's won 2 Nobel Prizes for her research in radiation, one of the first women to win a Nobel Prize, and did a lot of great research in radiation that really propelled our science forward. Unfortunately, at the time, she didn't know, as nobody did, that radiation could have deadly health effects. And so she was quoted often saying, she'd carry the test tubes of radioactive substances around in her pocket, as if she was like kind of enamored by the faint blue glow that it was giving off. And she never succumbed to acute radiation syndrome, but later on she did end up passing away, I believe, of aplastic anemia, because over time her bone marrow was affected. But all cancers are increased by exposure to radiation. In general, the types of cells that are most affected by radiation are cells that are rapidly dividing, are cells that are actively growing, okay, and actively being replaced. And so you think of cells such as, your blood cells. They're being actively dividing and replacing themselves all the time. They're very susceptible to radiation and can be affected with very small doses of radiation. You think of your neurons. Those are cells that do not divide often, if at all, and they take a lot larger doses of radiation to be affected by it, okay? And so we tend to see cancers in areas where you have rapid cell division and rapid cell growth. Okay, there are some prenatal effects to radiation, as I'm sure many people are aware. As the fetus is growing and dividing, again, rapid cell growth, rapid cell division. If you provide a big dose of radiation during that time, you can cause some birth defects, and some of them can be fatal, and some of them can lead to miscarriage. And again, we also already talked about mental health consequences of radiation. Let's talk about radiation and cancer. How does it cause cancer? This is a big discussion in the medical field, especially we talk about it in emergency medicine, which is the field that I'm in most often. Okay, this is it's very nice to send people through the CAT scanner and get answers, very quickly. Let's just send them through the CAT scanner. It'll make us all feel better because we have a normal CAT scan. We can send the people home. However, we have to think about this very carefully because, like I said, I send you through a CAT scanner and I'm giving you 3 years worth of radiation in one moment in time. And that could potentially be dangerous for you. And so I have to weigh the pros and cons of this and say, well, for a small child who my suspicion is very low that anything's wrong, but I still have some suspicion, would it be better to risk cancer in 30 years in this child? Because we know that about 1 in 1,800 children that I send through a CAT scan machine, I may cause cancer in 30 years. Do I do that, or do I maybe admit them to the hospital, press on their belly more times, see if we really need it later on? Okay, and it can be a difficult decision to make. Ultimately, CAT scans have saved lives and they're important, but we have to be in the medical community. We have to be responsible with how we use it because it can also damage health. For those of you who may be more interested in it, there's an Image Gently campaign that kind of gives some more information about responsible use of CAT scanners, especially in children, or all radiation in children. And I also think it's important to mention, because there's a lot of hysteria around radiation. I think a lot of it comes from the media, a lot of it comes from Hollywood. What radiation does not do, okay? So radiation, being exposed to a massive dose of radiation is not going to spontaneously mutate you a third arm, okay? It's not going to make a hybrid out of a cat and a bird. It's not going to give you superhero powers, okay? The effects of radiation are very scientific, and we know how they affect the body, and they do cause damage. They cause cell damage, and they can cause mutations later on through the cell lines and through generations of people. We have seen that. However, these immediate effects, creating monsters and creating disfigured, multi-armed people, like those things do not happen. Okay, so that's kind of a large, quick but a lot of information overview of the medical effects of radiation. Okay, we're going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, well, what are some of the areas that we may expect to have a radiation type event happen to us? What are the different types of radiation that are surrounding our own communities? And I've kind of narrowed it down into 3 main areas that we would focus on in terms of possible radiation threats. Okay, there's the medical device exposure that we've talked about quite a bit. There's war and terrorism. There's the dirty bomb, and there's the nuclear weapon, and then there's also nuclear power. This is a recent Fukushima example in 2011 is a good example of nuclear power exposures. I'm not going to spend, again, a lot of time on medical device radiation. We talked quite a bit about that, the Guyana incident with the teletherapy capsule. And the type of radiation we may expect to be gamma and neutron radiation, strong, penetrating radiation that can cause problems. The dirty bomb. So the dirty bomb is a distinct type of radioactive device that is very different from a nuclear weapon. Okay, so a nuclear weapon it creates a large explosion through a fission-type reaction. A dirty bomb is basically taking something like a teletherapy capsule, putting all that stuff in just a conventional explosive device and setting it off. And so the danger of the dirty bomb, honestly, is probably mostly just because of the trauma of the explosion, okay? But in addition to that, you will have some radiologic contamination of individuals who are nearby the blast. Okay, so you're going to get some of that substance on you, and you may inhale or ingest some of that substance. So those are some of the things that we worry about with a dirty bomb. However, the actual explosion itself will probably cause more problems than any of the radiation that is inside that event. Nuclear weaponry is something that, as many of you are aware of, is in the news often, and most nations want to have one of these devices. This is a picture that Charles Levy, one of the pilots that flew over, I don't remember now at this point if this was Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but he took a picture after they dropped the bomb out of his B-29 bomber of the explosion. I think it's Nagasaki now that I think about it. So what do we worry about with nuclear weaponry? There's the explosion itself. You have a large explosion this time because you're actually having a nuclear reaction that's leading to this explosion, okay? And then after the explosion occurs, you then have oftentimes nuclear fallout, and these are highly radioactive particles that are now kind of falling from the sky and dusting the landscape, okay? A lot of the intense initial blast of radiation is what's going to cause most of the injuries. You're going to have a radiation of people with very high doses of radiation after a nuclear event, but you can have problems with the fallout as well. That's a little bit of a lower radioactivity, but can also be a problem. And this is Fat Man. This was the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. I'll mention this briefly. The neutron bomb is something that has been discussed. It was kind of when I was a child in the Reagan administration. I don't know if I'm sorry if it makes me seem a little young now to say that, but so in the Reagan administration, the neutron bomb was a big topic because they thought it was very cool that you could basically deploy a device that would give large amounts of radiation but not a huge shock wave, and so we could kill lots of people but not destroy the buildings, right? So that was kind of the idea. Mostly deployed as kind of a tactical device, kind of in battle was the idea, so you could kill the enemy and not, blow up entire cities. That was kind of the idea of it. I thought it might be interesting to give a little perspective about what it would look like in San Francisco should a nuclear device go off. I don't want anyone to have nightmares about this or anything. This is kind of just an interesting discussion, okay? So this pin drop is right over UCSF, okay? Right where we are right now. And this is Little Boy. This is the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And if that bomb were dropped right on UCSF, you can see that the fireball itself is not incredibly large, larger than any other bomb that we would have, but the fireball itself is this orange area, and that would definitely take out the block, okay? The shock wave and thermal burns would probably extend, out past Golden Gate Park and, getting pretty close to Geary Boulevard. That's a Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon that was ever deployed in combat, okay? The largest nuclear weapon that was ever deployed as a test bomb was called Tsar Bomba. It was a 50 megaton device that was deployed by the Soviet Union. And this was a test bomb. This was never used in warfare, but it was detonated. And you can see that fireball alone would encompass the entire city of San Francisco. And you would have third-degree thermal burns out to Fairfield. Okay, it's a massive explosion. The Soviets at the time said they had been able to rig a bomb to be 100 megatons, and that bomb they thought could maybe get thermal burns almost to Santa Rosa. I mean, that's a massive explosion, but that bomb was never tested. Okay, out of the world of nuclear weapons and into nuclear reactors. Okay. This is one of the more pressing issues because we've seen these nuclear reactor events happen a few times in our history. Think of instances like Chernobyl, instances like Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. And nuclear reactors are actually being decommissioned in the United States at a reasonably quick rate. The most recent one to be decommissioned was down here in San Onofre. That reactor's been decommissioned. They no longer have it. The only one in California now is Diablo Canyon. This is Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant, and that's a few hundred miles south of us. So what do nuclear reactors do? The idea is for any power plant, how can we effectively heat water to turn a turbine and then create electricity? Nuclear reactors use enriched uranium to do this, and the benefit of it is it does not take a whole lot of fuel to heat this water, create the steam, turn the turbines. However, the downside of it is this fuel is very, again, radioactive and deadly. So if it's not contained appropriately, or you have some sort of disaster where the cooling mechanisms fail, or the rods melt, or something like that happens, then you've created a public health disaster. The Japan tsunami in 2011 was our most recent nuclear reactor event. The earthquake itself actually did not cause any damage to the reactor. What happened to cause the damage was the tsunami afterwards took out their cooling systems. And even though they had emergently shut off their power, or shut off their nuclear reactors, there's still residual heat from the nuclear rods that they were not able to effectively cool. And this led to explosions in three of the reactors. So there's a lot of hysteria, a lot of things. These are some things that I just got by typing into Google Fukushima nuclear explosion. Okay, these are websites that said, the days of eating Pacific fish are now over. The California coast is now going to be a dead zone. A plague of damaged thyroids is coming. Fukushima is the end of humanity. Okay, so there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of hysteria and panic that can be occurring from any nuclear event, and Fukushima is no exception. So what actually happened at this event? So again, there was no damage actually from the earthquake. The heat from the reactors that they were not able to cool because their cooling mechanisms failed ended up creating hydrogen explosions in their reactors. This is reactor number 3 that had a large explosion. And there were a few sequelae of these explosions. The first, of course, is you get radiation release into the air. So after the explosion in reactor number 2, there was a large release of radiologic substances, mainly cesium, into the air. But luckily, they had actually evacuated the population of that area 3 days before that happened, so there was very little effect to the population from that. In terms of the actual plant itself, when the explosions occurred, this is reactor number 1 after the explosion, there were no actual radiation casualties. There were 6 workers who received doses of about 25 rem, beneath the level that would cause the acute radiation syndrome that we discussed, but still significant amount of radiation. In terms of the population of Fukushima, there were 146 total workers who received 10 rems or greater of radiation that the health officials are going to be following closely, right, for many, many years. Okay, but the rest of the Fukushima population received maybe 1 rem over a lifetime is what they are estimating. So over the lifetime of people who continue to live in the Fukushima area, they may receive about an abdominal CT scan worth of radiation extra in their lifetimes that otherwise with just normal background radiation they wouldn't have. And what about all this about the days of eating Pacific fish are over and our coastline of California is going to be affected? Probably a little bit overblown. There is measurable increases in radiation from this event in the waters off the coastlines of the West Coast. However, most of the radiation increase has actually probably been caused by nuclear weapons testing over the last 50 years and not so much from this exact event. So we probably have more radiation floating in the ocean from nuclear weapons testing than we do from this Fukushima event. They do show that fish caught off the coast of Oregon do have increased levels of radiation, but still probably insignificant to cause any damage to humans. This gentleman from an oceanographic institution said, people are making irrational decisions about spending time at the coast or attributing starfish deaths to Fukushima. Dental x-rays and airplanes have greater exposures than what we are measuring in the water. Okay, gives a little bit of perspective of kind of what we're dealing with. The UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation said that radiation exposure following the nuclear accident at Fukushima did not cause any immediate health effects. It is unlikely to be able to attribute any health effects in the future among the general public and the vast majority of workers. So this event, up till this point, has been very well contained, and they're still, even now, working to continue to contain this event. But up until this moment, they've done a very good job at containing it, and unlikely that we're going to be seeing many problems or many health effects. So let's bring it home a little bit. What about a radiation event that occurs in our city or something like that? What do you do? How do you keep yourself as safe as you can and protect your family and friends? Okay, so if a radioactive event were to occur and you were already inside your home, what you should do is get to the center of the home, away from ceiling, away from walls, because this is where radioactive substances would tend to accumulate. Turn off anything that would bring air into your home and wait for instructions, okay? If you are outside, again, one of the most dangerous effects of radiation would be to inhale it or ingest it. So cover your mouth with a cloth or a towel. Get to a building immediately. Before you go inside that building, you should take off all of your clothes that are contaminated. And it's been shown that most contamination from radioactive events, actually from any contamination event, whether it be radioactive, chemical, biologic, most contamination can be removed simply by taking off your clothing, okay? So getting inside, removing your clothing, getting clean clothing on is important. Once you're inside, it will be important to stay inside until you hear otherwise from a health official, okay? We call this sheltering in place. And this is why it's so important. You know, San Francisco, we talk about this all the time because of earthquakes, but it applies to any sort of disaster, and that is disaster preparedness. Having this home kit with water, medical supplies, food, things that you know are safe and not contaminated is very important. Tap water in these events, typically thought to be safe to use to decontaminate yourself, but you probably shouldn't drink it until you're told by the health officials that it is safe to drink, okay? And so up until that time, bottled water is kind of the preferred or stored water. Other things that you can do to protect yourself during an event, we talk about 3 things that decrease your exposure to radiation or can increase your exposure to radiation, and that is time, distance, and shielding. So the time effects are pretty linear. So if I stand in front of 1,000 rads for 5 minutes, well, not 1,000 rads. That's incorrect. If I stand in front of something that's producing 5,000 rads an hour for 10 minutes or 5 minutes, I'll receive twice the dose at 10 minutes than I would at 5 minutes, okay? And if I stand for 20 minutes, I'll get twice the dose as I would at 10 minutes, okay? It's a linear effect. In terms of distance, this increases your dose exponentially. So if I stand at something that's producing that much radiation, and let's say I'm getting 10 rads standing 10 feet away, if I get 5 feet away, I'm gonna get something like 40 rads, okay? So it exponentially increases the closer you get. Then, of course, shielding is extremely important. All of you probably experienced getting an X-ray and having the lead put on you to help shield from radiation. Again, depending on the type of radiation, that will be more effective than others. And alpha radiation can be stopped by a piece of paper. Gamma radiation may penetrate through a foot of concrete, okay? So it can depend. And then this device here is called a Geiger counter, okay? That will let you know if something is radioactive, okay? And then the other thing that some people, especially people who work in the radiation industry, so if you work at a nuclear power plant or at a Los Alamos or something like that, you use a dosimeter, and that is typically a badge that people wear that will tell people if they have received a certain dose of radiation over a certain time. And so it'll change a color, let's say, once it reaches some threshold of 10 rads or something like that, okay? Other things just to mention briefly, many of you may have heard of potassium iodide as something that you should take after being exposed to radiation. This does have some use. It's been shown to be effective for specific types of radiation. Specifically, iodide 131 is a radioactive iodide. And the idea is it's going to protect your thyroid if you take this. It will protect no other part of your body, and it will protect you from no other type of radiation other than radioactive iodine, okay? And the idea is it's going to saturate the thyroid gland with the non-radioactive iodide that you take before your thyroid gland takes up that radioactive iodide, okay? And it's going to protect from future cancers is the idea. And finally, just a quick note about half-life, okay? So you'll hear the half-life of radiation, and what does that mean? So half-life means, roughly, it's the time it takes for 1/2 of the radioactive substance or radioactive atoms to disintegrate. So it's not a fixed starting point, it's not a fixed ending point, okay? I may come across this radioactive substance after 1 billion years, and I would start measuring the half-life at that moment, even though it's been decaying for 1 billion years, okay? So it's not a moment, it's not a fixed endpoint or a fixed starting point. And just because something has decayed for a half-life doesn't mean that it is now a safe substance either. Okay, it's still radioactive, it's just half as radioactive as it was at the beginning of the time you were measuring it. So to put things in perspective, these are all substances that were released in the Chernobyl event, okay? The radioactive iodine, its half-life is 8 days, so it can become inert pretty quickly. The cesium-137, after 30 years, it's only gone through 1 half-life in that time. And you can see uranium-235, which is sprinkled kind of all around the core when it had its explosion. That half-life is around 700 million years. And so the radioactive events at Chernobyl can have lasting consequences. And this is a picture of Chernobyl. They're trying to build a containment vessel around Chernobyl. Right now, they expect to be done somewhere in 2030 or so to try to contain some of that 700 million years worth of radiation that's still flowing. So in summary, ionizing radiation, this is the type of radiation that can harm you. It's distinct from the non-ionizing form of radiation. Health effects of radiation include the acute radiation sickness as kind of those acute effects. In terms of long-term effects, you have cancer, birth defects, and mental health problems. The radiation threats that are things that we prepare most for or most familiar with potentially happening are things like medical device exposures, dirty bombs, and nuclear weaponry. And I should have here, nuclear power as well. And then probably the most important point of the whole discussion is not just for radiation, but also for any type of disaster, really important to have a home disaster plan. Have disaster preparedness plan at your home, have extra food, extra water that you know is not contaminated so that you're able to protect yourself during one of these events, okay? And here's just a reference slide. I'm happy to send out any references if people are interested, okay? I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at this point. Please remind me if I don't to repeat your question so that people watching this will be able to hear it too, okay? Yes. So the question was, she has a friend who received radiation as a child and has now developed cancer, mesothelioma cancer. The question is, how come it took so long, first of all, to show up, and then after it shows up, how come it now grows so rapidly? And to answer the first part of that question, and when your friend initially received the radiation dose, it may have damaged some of those dividing cells only slightly. But then those damaged cells then divide themselves, and then divide themselves again, and then divide themselves again. And then it takes, over the course of time, many, many, many years before that damage can then compound to the point where it becomes dangerous. In terms of why now it's growing so quickly, I'm not sure that I could answer that question intelligently because I'm not an oncologist or a cancer doctor. I don't have a whole lot of experience treating cancer itself. It is. It's a long latency period. I agree. Right. So I don't know the exact dose of a panoramic X-ray in terms of how much radiation you get beamed with when you get a panoramic X-ray. But if I take it back to the other types of X-rays or CAT scanning devices, for instance. So you're looking at receiving a kind of a large dose of radiation at one time, and that dose in and of itself is going to increase your exposure or your possibility of cancer long-term down the line, okay? And again, for someone who is very young, so a small child, their risk of developing cancer 30 years from now is going to be higher than an adult who receives a dose of radiation from a medical therapy from them getting cancer later on. And so, for instance, I tend to be much more liberal with an 80-year-old who I want to look inside their belly than I am with a 2-year-old, okay? Because I know that, first of all, the cells of a child are going to be dividing faster, and therefore they're more susceptible to radiation. And I also know that they have a lot longer lifetime to develop cancer from that effect that I've caused as well. So with any type of radiation that a doctor puts on somebody, I think you just need to use it responsibly, and I think that's something that the medical field is getting better at, but it's something we need to improve on. So things like screening x-rays where we don't really have a reason to get the x-ray, we just want to check, okay? Things like that, the guidelines on when we do those and why we do those, we expect them to change a little bit as we learn more about the effects of radiation and what they can do long term. Sure, so the question was, in a radiation event where you have first responders and firefighters and paramedics and doctors and everyone that we're sending into these events, what are some things that can be done to protect them? So you could do probably a whole lecture on this for first responders, and first responders get lectures like this, okay? Whenever you are dealing with a radiation event like this, like the first responders in Fukushima had to do, there's a few things that can be done. The first is I mentioned those dosimeter badges. So there are badges that can tell you how long you've been exposed and the amount of radiation that you have, and you can have policies in place that say, I'm sorry, if you're doing a non-critical type event, let's say you're clearing debris, you can only receive 5 rads for the day, and then you're pulled out. Okay, and your little dosimeter badge can tell you that. Whereas you may have a higher threshold for somebody who's doing life-saving work. You may say, well, you can receive up to, 10 rads or something. I'm just kind of throwing out a number before we pull you out. If you're not using the dosimeter badges, if you know the dose of radiation that is coming out, you could just put time limits on how long somebody can stay in there. Okay, and that's probably the most common thing that we would do is say, you can't spend more than 30 minutes in there. One of the kind of tenets of EMS and first responder is the first thing that we have to do is make sure that a scene is safe for our responders. And if a scene is deemed unsafe, if we're not able to get in and out of that scene, obviously there's always risk, but if generally speaking you're not able to get in and out of that scene with your personnel intact, we won't go into that scene. We won't initiate it until we are sure that we can be safe. The question was, does UCSF specifically have a role in a radiation disaster event? And I think that's a complex question because it really depends on the event, and it really depends on how widespread the event is. I can kind of tell you in the event that a large radiation exposure that would create many casualties did occur within the city, the first thing that would happen would be activation of what's called our Emergency Operations Center, or the EOC, and that is a body where we all come together from multiple areas of kind of public governance and healthcare, from infrastructure to law enforcement to EMS to fire. We kind of get in this room and we strategize ways to manage this event from a central station. And in any sort of large event, not just UCSF, but every hospital would be receiving patients, and every hospital has been, I don't have all the numbers, but every hospital kind of knows, based on a casualty number, how many patients they may expect to get. And the Emergency Operations Center would be really key in making sure that no single hospital is overwhelmed with patients, and that we're spreading the casualties out equally. If we get to a point that is, overwhelms the city, then we're starting to talk about, federal disaster response and state response, and then we start getting really into the weeds about it. But in terms of what UCSF itself would do, I don't know their specific disaster plan for radiation exposure, but they would definitely serve a role in the city if there was some sort of large radiation exposure where we expected a lot of casualties. If you have any other questions, feel free to come approach me after, and we're happy to answer some more. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.